Good morning. Hi, everybody. I think it's probably about time for us to get started. So as you can probably tell, we're going to try and do something a little bit different this morning. I'm going to introduce our panelists in a second, but actually this isn't so much of a panel as more of a talk show, and that's why we're arranged in this slightly different arrangement. And we're also going to invite you guys to participate. We're going to try and get this moving quickly, but I'm just going to set us up a little bit here. What you were listening to was a sound artist's response to a painting from the National Gallery, and we really wanted to start to set the tone for today's discussion as creating more authentic experiences. And so that's also part of why we're setting up our panel the way that we are, to try and have a more authentic conversation amongst ourselves about this. So over to you guys. Who are we going to hear from today?
The following panel may include explicit language.
And possibly.
First thing I just want to say is that what we're kind of sort of doing, we're inspired by podcasts, so we're sort of doing a podcast. And I think one of the best practices I know about podcasts is you should do them for a few months and then they get good. So we're going to do we're going to do the best.
Yeah. You might get more of like the cable access version of the podcast. But I'll start, I guess, introducing myself. Hi, I'm Christine Murray, and I am a storyteller in kind of across platforms. I do a lot of audio work. I do documentary films. I work right now for Antenna Audio as a content specialist. And it's called Antenna International now. Sorry. And I spend a lot of time listening, and that's why I'm on the panel.
Okay. Hi, my name is Suse Cairns. You might know me from the podcast Museopunks. You might also not know me from that. I am from the Baltimore Museum of Art, now an Australian living in the US. I have had many interactions, run-ins with the music industry and radio industry over many, many years. I managed an independent record label many years ago. I was music coordinator for an independent radio station for a while. I podcast, and yet I really don't know anything technically. I am terrible at making things myself. I always rely on the goodness of others. In Museopunk's case, it was Jeff Inscoe, and he did all of the work, and I really just got to have really interesting chats, conversations with people. So that's me. I'm coming from that perspective of content, not technology.
Good morning. Hey, this is Dan Davis, and I'm from the National Museum of the American Indian. So my background, I was trained as a musician and studied composition, and then, was, sort of a washed-up rock star that then my part-time job in museums became my career. And so, but always my work in museums was really informed by how I think about music, how I think about rhythm. Even for visuals, I always think about how the music works. When I work on any media, I always look at the, how the audio is going to work first. I think the audio is incredibly important. I work at the Smithsonian. I try to be a bureaucratic troublemaker as much as possible. And I really have been so inspired and loved some of the recent podcasts that came out and that are coming out now. And I'm just fascinated to have this conversation with my colleagues and for you guys to listen and think about just the ideas that we have about how those podcasts can inform our museum work. So thanks. And I'm talking really close for my radio voice.
Hi everybody, I'm Natalie Marsh. I am the education manager at the National Music Center in Calgary. We are a new museum, not quite open yet, so I've been involved a lot in the exhibitions and developing soundscapes and describing content through the music of Canada and the landscape that has shaped that music. So I'm not coming necessarily from a podcasting perspective, but more of a programming perspective. I'll be presenting tomorrow about a digital storytelling project that I've been doing that's based around how do music and sound shape our community. So I have been working with K-12 teachers and adults all in digital storytelling. So I'll be coming more from a community and audience-based perspective and how they can support and contribute, and as well as how a museum can use music as a catalyst for creativity and discovery when you're in an exhibition space.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm Sophie Anderson. I am a content designer and strategist also with Antenna. And I'll be moderating our discussion today. And we're going to start off with just a few slides, but then I just want to kind of give you ample warning that the screen is going to go dark and it's going to be okay. But, you know, just as we've been kind of circling around a little bit, we are going to really talk about kind of the new phenomenons in audio. But taking a step back for a second, I think that many of us have a real sort of deep-rooted kind of idea about what audio is in museums. I think for many of us it kind of is considered very much a known entity, and it's, you know, much like the Campbell, you know, the Campbell soup can that we're looking at here by Warhol. At one point, it was really revolutionary to have audio in museums, to go from linear to random access, to include interviews, to get music in there, and everyone was really excited about that. And you know, it broke the mold at the time, but we've come a really long way. It doesn't have to be this templatized approach broken up throughout the museum in these little sound bites, and to kind of be reassured that that's going to reach the broadest possible audience. We kind of want to mess around with that concept a little bit. We know that stories connect. We know that storytelling is really important. We know that you know, in our practice as sound designers and sound producers, we try and get away from ramming facts down people's throats. But there's a lot more to say about making memorable stories, and that's what we want to try and get to today. Of course, serial is something that we've talked about a lot, and it was mentioned in the Great Ignite talk as you know, this incredible phenomenon, but it's really the tip of the iceberg. You know, serial was a massive success, and it focused people's attentions back on podcasting, but there's so much great work going on in that field. And as Sarah Koenig, who was, you know, one of the creators of the program, you know, has a great quote here that I included. It's not serializing storytelling isn't a new idea. It's as old as Dickens, and it's something that we can all be thinking about how to apply in our own organizations. And we're going to get into this a little bit too about how to apply it, you know, thinking about pacing, thinking about building anticipation, choreographing the experience, sometimes in slightly less didactic ways, sometimes, you know, not just random access or linear, but some combinations therein, and getting into much more complicated branching methods of storytelling. So, oops, I'm not going to share that slide just now, but that's going to be for us to come back to in a minute. And I think at this point I'm going to come back to the table, and the screen is going to go dark, and it's okay. And we're going to start by talking a little bit about intimacy in audio. So just a second.
I like that. The screen's going to go dark. It's okay. It's okay. We're not going to have a slide. There's not a mistake. Actually, that really does look a lot like a mistake, doesn't it?
Just while you're preparing, I have to say, just sitting here listening to your voice has been incredibly pleasurable. You have a very interesting voice for, you know, for my ears. I am happily listening in you know, in pleasant sort of, you know, somnambulant tones. It's very nice.
Crazy accent.
I think that's a kind of a great segue into the idea of intimacy and the power of the human voice, and how when I walked in, I am pursuing my master's degree at Johns Hopkins, and it's an online program, and I only get to hear voices of disembodied figures. And when I walked in, I actually recognized Len's voice, but I'd never seen him in person before, because he was one of the narrated lectures that I would listen to. And I think in storytelling and in podcasts, you don't necessarily see who the people look like. I had no idea what Sarah Koenig looked like until the Ignite slide. And I kind of intentionally chose to do that, because you become part of the story when you are void of visual, and you have the opportunity to create your own reality more so than when you turn on your eyes and have your visual there. So I think that's the intimacy, because you are a player in the storytelling.
I think also one of the things that I'm always very, very interested in incorporating in work that I make are in the way that you can look at a person and they have physical characteristics that are unique and fascinating for the eye, people have speech mannerisms, they have audio qualities, their voices, the peculiarities of the way that people express themselves isn't just about their word choice. It's not just about whether they have an up at the end of their sentence. It's a lot more than that. There are fabulous, fascinating quirks to every single voice out there. And I think for a long time, making audio guides, there was this, especially in the museum world, there was this standard of very clean, very professional, very white, and very edited experiences, and leaving in some of the mess, leaving in people's pauses while they're thinking, leaving in pops on the mic sometimes because they're really passionate about what they're saying, makes for a much more makes for a much more intimate listening experience.
I just wanted to say that, we know that you might already know some information, even something that's in a gallery. You may have read it again. But when you hear somebody talk about it or talk about an experience, you have a tendency, you can feel it. And when you feel what they're saying, it can have more of a resonance. So it's really important to think about that kind of intimacy. The other thing is when we looked at the array of podcasts up there, hopefully you're familiar with some of them, many of them are interview-based, so that's one kind of intimacy. The other kind of intimacy that I think works really well is this kind of conversation. So if you have a panel or you have people you like listening to, you like coming back to hearing what they're going to say, how they interact with each other, and that's another kind of intimacy that I think works really well in this format.
Not sure if this is, it's working great. I mean, one of the things we were talking about too, just in preparing this panel, was trying to create intimacy when the environment doesn't allow for it, and I wonder if you guys have thoughts about that to share.
I have lots of thoughts about that. Yeah, if it were up to me, I would interview absolutely every single person in their bedroom. Not necessarily about what goes on in their bedroom, but I think that when you take a person out of their most comfortable environment and bring them into a studio to ask them questions about something, they go into a particular mode of thinking and a particular mode of presentation that interviewing someone in their own environment, whether it's the artist's studio or an archaeologist in a field, or the ant-man in standing in front of his bugs in the basement of the Museum of Natural History, you get a sudden feeling of place, even if you're not doing ambient sound. You get a feeling from the voice of where that person is standing or sitting or talking with you. I think Mark Maron's garage is a great example. It feels different. The conversation is different because it's happening in a garage and not in a studio.
I actually think this is really interesting. With Museopunks, we would record via Skype or Google, sometimes with actually visual, but if we were getting bad wires, we wouldn't be able to see anyone. And I always thought it was an incredibly challenging thing, and I kind of found it quite fascinating when people would talk about like the chemistry of presenters and things like that, because to me I was like, we're across the other side of the world, it might be midnight for me and 10 a.m. for someone on the other side of the world. But interestingly, we were always interviewing people who were either in their homes or in their offices. So maybe that sense of comfort of people actually being in, often people had like a cup of tea, or there was a sense of being in a comfortable place, even though we couldn't see each other and interact. So maybe intimacy, I'd always thought it related to face-to-face and having these moments, but actually maybe intimacy is so much more contextual than that.
I know in the digital storytelling project that I do, I send a kit out to schools, and it's filled with H1 Zoom audio recorders. And I encourage teachers, despite their worry that kids are taking this technology out of the classroom and the risk that might come with that, I encourage them to do so. And the magic that comes back is the oopses on those audio recorders. When the kids have taken them home, they've recorded the sounds of their neighborhood, the train going through their little town, One girl singing "Call Me Maybe" in a bathroom because it had good acoustics. Like you start to get the sense of where these people are, where they live in their homes, and what they found to be not a polished audio recording is actually the most magical audio recordings, because it does have that sense of context, place, and personalness that creates intimacy.
I was just going to mention the great, well, we tend to work in these spaces that are probably the worst for sound that can be made. I mean, they tend to be monumental, echoey spaces. So it's just this kind of irony, and it feeds this idea that we shouldn't record in those spaces. However, the intimacy between a content expert and the actual piece is different than recording in a studio with a replica. So this is just a balance that we have to deal with. There's also some applications where the sound of the space may work well within the experience, But one of the things we'll get to eventually is this idea of site specificity, where the audio works. We're talking about two kind of different things, an audio guide and a podcast.
I have one other intimacy thing I was going to say about. Went out of my head. I'll come back to you. After this commercial break.
We're going to edit that out. So
one thing many years ago I worked with a record producer. I was working with a young independent band, and they were about to record their first EP, and we were working with a really experienced record producer. And we were talking about different ways of getting different emotional feelings into songs. And one of the things that he said that stood out to me is if you have a song that speaks to childhood, if you have a song that has a sense of wanting to go back, then you weave in the tiniest little underground layer of something referencing, say, a nursery rhyme. And it's not conscious and it's not up in your face, it's just very subtle. And even that weaving, sound is such a memory device that actually you can bring in the subtlest emotions in people. You can create these feelings from things that someone isn't aware of. So when you were talking, Dan, about that idea of actually recording in these monumental spaces, it can actually be an incredibly useful device to record something in a monumental space if that is the thing you're trying to communicate about that object. So, yeah. Go.
I remembered what I was going to say. So one of the things that kind of plays off what you were saying earlier, about the kids taking recorders home, one of the things that I think if you're looking for intimacy or offhandedness or candor in the work that you want to present, making the microphone disappear is a huge, huge aspect of that. And luckily, we have really amazing equipment out there in the market now that allows that to happen. I'm working right now with a whole group of interpretive media people in a museum that cannot be named, but the curators, we have a
we have
what is that?
We have meetings at the beginning of every kind of audio batch that we're doing with the curatorial staff, and I bring a very small H2 Zoom and I record those meetings, and the energy and dynamic and giggles and laughter, and I always bring food. Those conversations often I end up using, but the curators aren't aware of it. I use those either as ambi sound later. Sometimes I go back and try to recreate that same conversation, but with more pristine audio, and then I'm mixing the both together. One of the things that it's really informed me also, Sophie's done this, I know, in work that she's done as well, is I try to get the curators, if there are 3 different curators who all have an investment in some piece of art, I don't interview them individually. I bring them into a space where there's a couch, we have coffee and muffins, and they each have a microphone. Sometimes I put them in labs, and then they really forget that they're being recorded. Sometimes they go to the bathroom and forget that they're being recorded. So that's another kind of trick to getting, through sort of beyond the presentation mode of I am going to deliver you my expertise right now, and I'm going to take on a certain authoritative voice.
Can we play a clip?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
You guys have a thought about what you'd like to hear?
Yeah, I have that middle school clip.
Yeah,
So
good. Yeah.
I have a clip here. Thank you, Sophie, for technically figuring this out. It's from This American Life, and they do a lot of different kinds of stuff, but this really brings alive, I think, middle school and really is very, very intimate.
I might just see if I can play it like this rather than.
This is an example of bad audio, but go for it. That's not it.
That was my mom. She said that if I don't wear the 2 shirts that I'm wearing right now, that I can't go to the dance.
Did you get asked to the dance?
Yes, I did.
And what did you say?
I said I don't know, but I probably won't say yes. I was in the cafeteria, just got a drink of root beer, and she walks up to me and asks me to go out.
What did she say exactly?
She said, "Chris, will you go out with me?"
They split the gym in half, so it's light on one side and pitch black on the other side. All the 6th graders are kind of banned from the dark side, but that's where all the cool kids are. So now we're in 7th grade, we can dance on the dark side. So it's woo, we're cool. Don't dance on the dark side.
It was specifically on the flyers.
Listen to this guy.
They give you the dress code and then they give you the rules. No petting, and it's in quotations. You never know what it means. It's do people sit there and dances and just pet other people? It's really weird.
But yeah, amazingly intimate and really personal. And if you read that, it would be funny and it would be interesting. But there's so much personality in those voices, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that aha moment, that tingle moment, is something we were all talking about and how to get that. And I think you've all been touching on that in different ways. That there's this moment where kind of the hairs stand up on the back of your neck and you are connected to what you're listening to. And I know Christine and I have talked about this example a lot about how binaural audio is really moving in that direction of kind of going that step further of taking what you're listening to and providing this incredible kind of surround experience that changes also that sense of the words and the content and takes it right into an experiential quality. And I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit in our discussion, but I feel like that difference between what's live, kind of recorded, and then also the way in which it communicates orally is really important, I think, in creating that aha tingle.
I think, too, I like that point because the importance, the popularity of Serial or some of the podcasts is that it has a resonant level for everybody. Everybody loves scandal. Everybody loves the juicy nuggets or stories, or we can all connect to it on some way. I think in that Ignite talk there was the quote about starting with a question. That's why this digital storytelling project did start with a question. What does music and sound mean to you? Well, that is so open-ended, it could mean anything. And the diversity of responses I'm getting back is really quite powerful and telling of what our community is connecting to and what's going on out there. But also importantly is that you end on a question too, that you keep people thinking and keep people talking about it and wanting to know more through that common, whether it's a memory, whether it's a personal story, or whether it's scandal or the unknown, right? Those are kind of those common threads that we can all connect to.
I'm just wondering, actually, we promised that we would invite questions from the audience, and I think before we kind of dive too deeply into more discussion, I'm wondering whether anybody wants to comment or has a thought about any of that.
We're here to listen to.
So I think everyone here really understands the value of the authentic voice in a comfortable environment and telling a story that way. I wondered what experience you all had with working with a curator or an expert who wasn't comfortable with that type of voice, who wanted to be an authority and wanted to have an authoritative voice coming from an audio experience.
It's a big challenge. I mean, many curators, one way that I really, I'd advise is you don't give them the questions ahead of time. So they want to know the questions. They're going to want to try to get to essentially their stump speech, which is fine because it's a lot of great information. Some curators just are going to be deadly. I mean, they're going to be tough. I mean, but it's not like trying to take them off their game, but it's really trying to even get a curator to speak extemporaneously still gives a lot more life than them delivering label text that they've studied over. So you do get personality that way.
No, you. I was going to
Oh gosh, I have so many. So I have a theater background, so I have a lot of ways that I try to loosen people up. And if I can't loosen them up, I will write around them in, for example, I had some curatorial commentary recently about a surreal object sculpture. And the material was pretty dry. And so I wrote a surreal audio stop around it, and then said at some point, basically the narrator of the stop was deeply confused by the object. The object starts talking to the narrator, trying to help her understand it. And at some point, she just realizes that she needs like a art fairy godmother, and then there's a kind of big reveal, and then this curatorial voice comes in and explains everything. So it was sort of a creative way to write around and sort of poke fun. I mean, I think one of the things that makes audio feel really, really authentic right now is that acknowledging the fact that, hello, we're making an audio tour. We know that you're listening to something that we made, and we know that this person, by the way, is kind of boring. So I think you can actually work with that, make that a strength. The other thing I would say that I do, I'm neurotically over-prepared always for my interviews. And if you've got the time and you've got the access and you've got the budget, you should interview a person more than once. And you should ask them the same questions, referring to what they've said before, so even if you do a pre-interview and you don't record it, although it's great to have both recorded, but even if you do a pre-interview first, or if you interview a person, a curator, and then you interview someone else that has a different perspective, and then you go back to the curator and say, you said this, but so-and-so said that, and I'm kind of interested in what can you kind of help me reconcile those two ideas? And that starts getting at the question sideways instead of, as Dan said, the stump speech,
Something else we've been talking about a lot, sorry, I'll definitely come back, is thinking about when in the process you do those interviews, because often this kind of work happens right at the end of a really, really, really long cycle of incredible work that's happened internally. And I think we've been kind of brainstorming around ideas where, if you open up this process to a more journalistic approach and really follow the development of the academic research, the kind of early phases, the point at which the people involved in the project are still super passionate, just to be blunt, by the time we often get involved, people have so many other priorities and their attentions are really diverted, and they've really had to boil down everything that they're thinking about into the stump speech, into nuggets, into sound bites, which then really sound very dead to the listener. So even, with all the different techniques, that's just the reality. So I think, it's a little bit scary to think about it in journalistic terms, because there might be some stuff in there that isn't quite as formulated, but it's not necessarily about releasing it early. It's about gathering that material in the process and then having a lot more to work from at the end. And then I think you can kind of do those techniques of, questioning.
I'll just mention real quickly, and you probably already know this, but doing interviews, you can really get a different response by how you ask questions. So if I have somebody who is kind of a motor mouth, my next question I want to ask them may be a lot slower to try to give them this idea. We're going to talk more slowly now. I don't want to say, can you slow down, because that's going to make them self-conscious. You can also, so you can kind of prompt them by the way in which you're asking questions. In the same token, maybe you can do the interview in a different place. Maybe you can sort of set up a situation where you get different responses. And the other thing I think we probably know from doing production is it doesn't always work for curators because they'll never shut up, but you can wait. When someone naturally comes to the end of a sentence, you see if they have something else to say. That can reveal something really unexpected.
That always gets you something good.
Well, with curators, it
sometimes gets you another half hour. But often the nugget will happen then. It's true. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I totally understand this thing about curators in front of objects. We do a lot of recording, and there's a lot of different opinion about how much background sound distracts or is part of, and so the problem is that when you get into these conversations or these things about like how are we going to do the work, what's going to be the best way to do it, and you want to say let's record in front of the object because we get the best story. They say no, we can't do that. So I'm wondering if you have, as a group, a really good example, or like it's kind of like finding the one convincing tour that's like, see this is the one that really worked. We're going to do it like that, or there's got to be. Because I'm not. I mean, I wanted to say I just had a conversation with somebody who talked about Mona's approach, the Museum of New and Old, and the approach is very lo-fi, but very immersive, and you're in these locations and conversational. So there's a real value to that. But then the question is, what are some good examples of when you're in the gallery and you've got good fidelity, you've got good production, you've got a really great story, and you're in the museum. I'd like to just know if you have any suggestions of where to go to hear that.
Well, Airprint Productions does some pretty good work.
Struggle with that.
Yeah. I think it's a really a tough one. And to be honest, I think some of the times when I hear this work well has been on podcasting. So we developed a podcast series for the National Gallery. They actually did 100 episodes, and a lot of those recordings happened in the galleries. And I think that, again, sort of to what Dan was saying at the beginning, they had a lot of practice over time and just going back and doing it again and again and again. It didn't become this kind of awkward, unique scenario where putting a mic in front of someone. And I feel like what we did there was take that very journalistic approach. It sounds like a BBC kind of arts program, and it's less about that stump speech. And I think that's what it really comes down to is, putting. For me, it's not so much about the sound kind of quality, cavernous or not, and really more about that depth of emotional connection to the material, because that's the way that I fell in love with doing this work, was listening to amazing people giving incredible talks, and then trying to translate that is always the challenge. But I think that we have lots of ways of getting around it also by thinking about different kinds of voices we can use. But I think what's great about this conversation is we're talking honestly about the fact that we're not always going to have a different kind of a voice. We've got lots of great examples that we can play about using the artists, using crowdsourced audio, all that kind of stuff. But ultimately there is still this need to think about how to create an institutional approach that represents the storytellers within the organization. And I think that's why we're so interested in podcasting, because I think getting away from trying to do it in nuggets is, to me, the key, because it loosens up the whole approach.
One thing just on the Mona app, and this is very anecdotal, but I remember hearing David Walsh talk about that process, and this was very, very early on. But I think when he actually got Elizabeth to go out and do those interviews, it wasn't her background. I think she had a writer's background. She was actually just going out as a very interested person having conversations. And I think similarly, and this is where I'll tie it back to podcasts, I think when Jeff and I were doing Museopunks, it in part just came from the fact we'd been having such interesting conversations at conferences and we never got to take them home. And us doing the podcast was really a way of going, well, we're having great conversations and I want to keep having great conversations. And the podcast was just the thing that allowed us to have those conversations and then to share them with the world. And so I think that sense of, how you have something that progresses over time and where you develop skills but might actually start out pretty scrappy. Jeff he produced a podcast previously, so he had some experience with that, but it had been solo and we'd really never worked together. We'd met for about 15 minutes before we did our first podcast. And I think there is something in that sense of actually just wanting to ask the questions and have the conversation that helps that sense of, I suppose, authenticity of what you're trying to achieve. Is we didn't have a great sense of where we wanted to go. We just wanted to talk to cool people. To be honest. Yeah.
Can I just add something to Mona, just because you're talking about Mona so much. That stuff by Elizabeth is easily some of the most people hate it. Probably more people hate it than love it. Right. The people that love it really love it, but man, people really hate it. Yeah. Primarily because of the quality. So it was recorded on her phone. it was done so that she had notes that she could take back. It wasn't necessarily meant for like audio production, but people who love it, and it's goes with everything else that David does, that he doesn't really care when people hate things. He just wants people to have a reaction to them. And he was like, if people really love it or really hate it, he'd rather do that than have something that's just like middle ground. And I mean, that's his philosophy on museums anyways. It's like, you know, like so many things are done like middle ground that people just kind of like, yeah, whatever, you give up on it. Anyway,
I think there's something interesting in this conversation too, though, that there seems to be at this moment in time a real expansion of the audio palette. People's expectations are not that they are only going to receive one kind of experience anymore. I think that sort of speaks to Sophie's slide about the replicated soup can, that you know, people are going grocery shopping and listening to podcasts, and they're walking their dogs, and they're jogging, and they're doing their laundry, and they're going to museums. And so I think that there is this really incredible moment right now where we're being released from the tyranny of explaining the object and moving more into an experiential space where you can, wander through an art museum, you know, wander and look around and maybe have, you know, a sort of walking podcast kind of experience where the themes that maybe you're listening to, or the conversations that you're having, the people are having in your head, relate to the space that you're standing in.
Or not. I used to listen to Serial while I was in the art museum. So I would, on my lunch breaks, go and listen to Serial while staring at our at various parts of the museum. So I'd be sitting at these incredible works of art and listening to the tale of, you know, murder and trial and those sorts of things. And it was actually, that was my experience of listening to Serial. And so even that, you can have these very on the surface disjointed experiences that are working together. And I think that's one of the things of this audio that people carry with them, is they will also be bringing their own audio into your museum as well.
I'm wondering if we play your teaser?
Yeah, we can. I mean, I was just going to pick up on this, that what we're really unpacking here, hopefully it's a little obvious, is that there's a big difference between an audio guide stop and a podcast. When we work in museums, I mean, we're saying, wow, what's your attention span? How long are you going to stand in front of a piece? And it's a pretty big success and a great achievement to do a 30-second stop that works really well. Now, when we talk about podcasts, we're talking about almost unlimited time. If you listen to Dan Carlin, you know, there's, you know, it can be a 13-hour session on a topic. So super, super deep dives. Plus, we're really talking about the difference between site specificity. We assume you're here, and we're going to do some guided looking at something, versus you could be running, chopping vegetables. You could be at the museum and listening to Serial, but you don't have to be. You can walk out of the museum. That's a really interesting space for museums to think about how to provide another way to to get it to these ideas.
So, do you feel comfortable if I play your teaser a little bit, just to that? Or
is this the Smithsonian Podcast, or which one?
Think again.
Yeah, so the Smithsonian, some colleagues of mine are starting a podcast series. This is a proof of concept, and again, trying to build on this idea. One thing I thought was an interesting takeaway. These guys come from the marketing department at Smithsonian. They titled it Think Again. It's kind of a cool idea. And I said, so is it going to be Smithsonian Think Again? They're like, we're not using the name Smithsonian in this. I mean, we want it to be a podcast people listen to. Like, we want, it's like, you don't say, the Baltimore Museum of Art present, you say, no, this is just a museopunks. It's something, so right. I thought it was kind of an interesting idea. So you can listen to this proof of concept and see what you think.
What do you think that would look like? Long, graceful, poopy brown flower. If an orchid had an online dating profile, what do you think that would look like? Long, graceful, poopy brown flower with bloody red movable labellum covered with hairs and little Siri that resemble maggots.
I would swipe right to that so fast. Welcome to Think Again, a new podcast that looks at ideas and things we think we know.
We're your host. I'm Alex Giovanni.
And I'm Tony Cohn.
Tony.
That is right. And today we are here to talk about, say it with me, Alex,
Love. Universal emotion.
So real casual and real, it's not, what you think of as a museum piece. And they're directly doing that. They're thinking, how can we do this? And they're saying the obvious, like, wow, there's so much great expertise here, especially at a place like the Smithsonian. But what if we, try to maybe not promote a direct show, but just promote the ideas, the diffusion of knowledge in our case?
I instantly love that I have their names. So it's one of the things that I really love about podcasts as art is that every time there's the same intro music, every time there's the same, like when Guy Raz from the TED Talks podcast says, I'm Guy Raz. Like there is something very reassuring about this sort of repetition of content that then leads into other places. It's one of the things I love about podcasts is there is often a way that people start the show every single time. Similarly with ads. Ads can be very different in their format, but also have these ways of connection that you have points of difference and points to come back to.
I think also, I think having a narrator who's a human being with a point of view cannot be oversold. I think if you're, one of the things that we're all trying to break out of, I think, and get to with authenticity especially, is how do I relate as a person to what I'm hearing? And you're often hearing a human voice, but it's kind of the humanity has been stripped out of it. They don't have this voice doesn't have an opinion, it's stating a bunch of stuff. Maybe it's leading you through an experience or telling you a story, but you don't know who that person is that's telling you that story. And even if they're a curator, the only information you have about them is curator, so-and-so and so-and-so. This is why people love celebrity audio tours, because when Sarah Jessica Parker is talking about shoes, you actually feel like you know the person that's talking. So I'm all about right now writing opinions, having a narrator have an opinion, have a narrator stand in front of a painting and go, I don't know about you, but I think that's ugly. And then explore what's going on in the painting, and then maybe at the end the narrator's like, maybe I don't think it's as ugly as I once did.
Because podcasts and that idea are putting the listener almost before the speaker, where I feel like audio tours are speaker first and then the audience is a secondary participant, which is backwards. And so that's why you don't have a connection, where if all of our common pieces that we were just describing are thinking about how am I going to connect to that visitor so that they listen and they also connect back to me. It's more dialogue as opposed to just information, and that's where audio tours and podcasts, and even just using sound as a storytelling element in an audio gallery, makes it become more personal and more relevant.
To that point, I'm wondering whether we should play one of your stops.
You want to play? Yeah. Okay. So it's just a little sample. It's one of those serendipity nuggets that I found when I was creepily going through the H1 Zooms when they were returned from a school. And this was just the teacher experimenting and letting the kids play with audio and sound and tell a personal story.
My dad came from at the time my dad was 4 or 5. My dad came from Vietnam. At the time my dad was 4 or 5, war was happening and my dad had to leave. They left on a boat. And while all the people, including my dad, were on the boat, Canada said that they will take some refugees to Canada. They wore one type of clothes and they brought nothing. They came to Canada because of freedom here, and there were a lot of opportunities here.
I think that's really great. I mean, you're in the middle, kind of in the early stages of your project, gathering audio, but I think the way in which you're going about it really speaks to many of these themes. It's kind of coming from that up. And I know you're still figuring out what you're going to do with it, but
yeah, sort of our next steps will be to compile all these audio and eventually create an exhibition within our space that is about the people of Alberta and all of the diversity and backgrounds. We're actually combining it, interestingly, with an oral history project. And I think when we were planning this, we talked a little bit about the difference between oral history and storytelling. They're not the same thing. And I think the dichotomy between the two is really rich, though. And we're not sure how this will all play out. I have no idea what the content is going to be and what kind of story, greater story, will come from all of those individual stories. That's kind of the exciting iterative process that we're going through right now. But it's just an example of the number of stories, in a sense, crowdsourcing, I suppose, that we're able to collect, that we're able to see, and just have, again, that dialogue. It might not be the one-on-one, face-to-face conversation, and I probably wouldn't have that with that student, but it's just another vehicle. Storytelling and audio is now a vehicle that we can communicate with the people in all of our communities.
And I think we've talked a lot about this idea of co-creating with our audiences, and I think that's what it really stems from, rather than that academic sense of oral history, but kind of co-creating the experience and starting from their perspective. I had another piece I wanted to play, which was a workshop that we ran with teens at the Noguchi Museum, where the teens themselves created the audio, and it was so fascinating to me because I really had no expectation for what the outcomes were going to be. They got a really free rein in terms of what they wanted to do, and they really wanted to kind of create these personal reflections. So I'm going to play a little piece.
Do you hear that? Well, that is the sound of my journey to the Noguchi. As I drive with my dad, the sound of New York City begins to dim down. It becomes relaxing in a way. And when I look out my window, the sun is beginning to set. I feel its warmth. Meanwhile, I admire the glistening aspect the water has as the sun reflects upon it. It contributes to this already existing serenity. This landscape reminds me of Noguchi's piece, The Sun at Noon. Through the usage of marble, Noguchi is able to reflect the sun glistening upon the water. And whenever I look at the piece, it reminds me of how beautiful nature is. But aside from that, it brings me back to memories of sitting by the water with my grandma and talking for a really long time, but feeling as if you're in a perfect moment. Anyway, this is what I want you to do. As you travel to the Noguchi, listen to the surroundings, and when you get there, go to the sun at noon, and then tell me how it makes you feel.
My name is...
So I love that piece because this girl obviously scripted something herself through a long process of working with the museum educators to really understand her own feelings about the collection, picking a work, creating her own response to it, recording it herself, editing it herself. You know, it just changed the entire way that I would have approached that. If I came in and said, I'm going to create something for teens, that is not what I would have created. And I think that all kind of goes to a point that is a lot of people talking about at the conferences here, which is about how the process of creating audio. And I think we can kind of come in and share a lot of our expertise and our thinking about strategies, but ultimately we're going to find a really different result if we work in a different way with our audiences, both outside of the museum, and I would kind of also talk about our stakeholders as audiences within the museum, and I think that's kind of what we're getting at in different ways. But yeah, I was just
going to build on something we kind of mentioned before. It kind of plays, but this idea of authenticity. So, you know, we have authentic voices. We know behind that authenticity there's some crafting, whether it's in the scripting or in the editing. Henry Louis Gates said that authenticity is the first lie of the 20th century. I mean, it's these are real, but we make them real. So we go and we play you an unedited interview or oral history. It may not play well. By the same token, many museums have taken fantastic lectures, and those lectures are for big audiences, and then release them as podcasts. That's fun. That's good information. I think it's really for the super fans, though, because when you listen to those, they're not intimate. They're delivered to a huge audience. So the information is there. yet sometimes they can be, it just doesn't, it has a different kind of effect.
I was going to say that I feel like I had an experiential version of this on a flight coming here, actually. There was an older gentleman sitting next to me who, the screen in front of you where it starts giving you all the flight data from about 12,000 feet until the second that we landed, he read it out loud to me and narrated basically our descent using this data. He was obviously like some retired pilot, and where the headwinds were coming from and the cross currents, all kinds of stuff. It was a really irritating experience for me. And especially as a listener. But the Antenna, the company, was originally a theater company, and it was born from an experience on an airplane. The guy that founded our company, who was a crazy theater artist, his name was Chris Hardman. He got a cassette Walkman, a Sony Walkman for Christmas in 1980, and he was on the airplane coming back to California from wherever he was visiting his family, where he got this Walkman, had a cassette tape in that thing, was listening to the Ride of the Valkyries as the plane was taking off. As it was flying down the runway and lifting off into the air, he was hearing dun, 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 up into the clouds. And he realized, oh my God, I have had this miraculously incredible theatrical experience because the sound matched what I'm going through, physically. And so I had that experience with the guy next to me. The sound was definitely matching what I was going through physically, but it was a very different experience.
And he's packing for the airport saying, I think I'm going to bring this tape. Yeah, I'll listen to Wagner. Yeah, that'll be good. Yeah, that'll be fun.
I think what you were talking about before, this idea of a crafted authenticity, I think is really important, because I think, again, it goes back to the distinction between something like oral history and what we're doing, where we're presenting and, artificially presenting this information, these experiences on. And I think that also goes to what a lot of what we do when we're producing. We might have a lot of material, and a bit like your example of, you're recording the curators and maybe you're mixing something in later. And I don't think these are things we should shy away from. I think there's kind of this idea, thankfully, pulling back from, anything our audiences say is something we should play back to them, and it will just be great, and it's not, and it's the same way that, we have that experience that you were talking about for, hours and hours of recording with a curator. Just playing that back in a podcast form wouldn't make it any more compelling.
You have to structure it in some way.
Yeah. So I was thinking about playing an example, actually, of where we recorded the artist Reineke Dijkstra and the subject of her work. And we recorded it separately, but I just think it's an interesting example of how something very, very object-specific, going back to that, I think has quite an emotional impact.
Almarisa. My name is Almarisa. I'm 24 years old. In 1994, me and my parents came to the Netherlands from Bosnia as refugees to escape from the war.
With this portrait, Dijkstra unexpectedly launched a project that continues to this day, her record of Almarisa.
One day, there came a lot of photographers in the refugee center. One of the photographers was Reineke Dijkstra. Me, as a little girl, I always looked at pictures of girls in magazines, so I thought, hey, maybe I will come in a magazine one day if that woman make a picture of me. But Reineke actually didn't notice me. Then I started to cry.
And I said to her, well, do you maybe have a dress or, something which is nice for the picture? And she went to her mother. 20 minutes later, she came back in her Sunday best. And it was so sweet.
That was my favorite dress. That was the one thing that reminded me of my world and my life in the safe place that we called home in Bosnia that wasn't safe anymore. But the socks, the blue-green socks are so awful. But that explains a little bit the way that we lived in that situation. You look at the picture, you see a cute little girl wearing a nice looking dress, and then you see that it's not perfect because the socks don't match. It was not nice to live in a refugee center. Living in a refugee center was like the green socks with the perfect dress.
It kind of gets me every time. It's just, you know, I think, again, that idea that it's sort of like an oral history, but then it's been kind of reconstructed afterwards with these other elements.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have one that's called the Red Wagon, I think, which is it's very different because it's not, it's very, very sound heavy, but it uses an oral history interview and mixes it with sound effects to give you a sense of place and time that the voice doesn't. Maybe it's Switzer. It's the Switzer piece.
I used to take a little red wagon with 5 years old down to the CPR tracks on 10th Avenue and 2nd Street West. In those days, there were no electric refrigerators. It was all ice boxes. And CPR train would bring in the ice and deliver it wherever it was needed. When they brought it in between the tracks, putting it on their trucks to deliver, different pieces would fall on the ground between the ramp. So I used to put my little red wagon there and collect the ice and take it down to 511 6th Avenue East where we lived. And at that point it was the red light district of Calgary. So I used to call in the girls and they'd buy my ice for 5 cents a load. I guess you'd call that my first job.
That piece we made for the Calgary Tower, which is a big observation tower where you look out over buildings over Calgary. And I had this idea that the landscape is full of really interesting people. That man happens to be the biggest philanthropist, the richest man in Calgary, who talked endlessly about his business enterprises and didn't really have a whole lot to say except I got really, really, really rich in oil and real estate. And so at some point I said, you know, well, do you remember the very first moment you made money? Like the very first time someone paid you for something? And he told that story. And I suddenly was like, wow, I can set everyone's imagination back in time to the moment when Sam Switzer was 5 years old, just with sound effects and just with that one little story, structuring it in that way, which made it more experiential than just someone telling the story of how he got rich in Calgary.
And the music obviously sets the time period really well. He doesn't say exactly you hear an old voice, but the music really does so much in that clip.
I'm conscious of our time, and we're kind of coming up to the end of our hour soon. We have so much more, obviously, we wanted to get to, but I did want to make sure if there were any other kind of directions that people wanted to ask about or questions before we wrapped up.
Hi, this has been great. I just have kind of a practical question. We're right now just starting to work on what will probably be a video interview series. We've done 2 of them so far. And listening to all this makes me wonder if maybe it should be a podcast. One of the things I've noticed is that the cameras and the lights and all that have maybe influenced how the interview goes a little bit. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you approach that and how you decide whether or not to have a camera in the room.
Well, I mean, I think the thing you have to ask yourself when you're doing a video is what is visual about this? So, I mean, if you're watching somebody talk, you know, it's nice to see their face, but I think, honestly, you can do a lot of great stuff with a audio slideshow, you know, so you can do audio and then use slides. But I think whether or not, I mean, I think what you're saying is having the lights, having them set up in this formal way, it does affect, it's harder to get something from it because ultimately we are talking about a bit of a performance. We're talking about somebody who either consciously performs or relaxes enough to to be themselves for that bit, and it's much harder to get there with the lights and camera.
Yeah, I think the other thing is thinking about where you want people to be consuming this. It's actually, if you're thinking for in-gallery, there's different advantages. If you're thinking for at home, you actually have to be somewhere with a screen if it's video. One of the things I think is really interesting with the rise of podcasting is a lot of people are putting it up to the fact that car technology has shifted so that people can actually listen much more easily to digital channels and to podcasts in their cars. But with a podcast, I just take mine around and I listen to it whenever I'm walking or driving anywhere at a distance. So also thinking about where you want people experiencing it might be part of that decision making.
I would just say, because I make documentary films, and just a very pragmatic level, if you are going to continue forward with your video, sit really, really, really closely to your interviewee. Don't let the equipment get between you. And really never break eye contact. Never let them stop looking at you once you start talking. Because they'll forget. They will if you connect in that way.
I think also practically, I'm working on a project right now where there's an online learning component and an audio in-gallery component. And it's with artists, and just practically speaking, the artists are located all over the world. And so there's an element of practicality involved and budgets. And also their comfort level. And I think you find that there are some people who are just much more comfortable, sort of what we were talking about for where you can interview people. Making that decision, can help as well. They, just will potentially open up a little bit more if they're at home. And it might not be something that you can plan for in advance. You might kind of have to feel your way through it depending on who you're talking to.
Thanks.
So at SF MoMA, we started producing a podcast in 2007, I think, and at the time, there was a certain amount of buzz around podcasts, even within museums, and a handful of museums started them then. A few years later, I took a survey as best I could to figure out what museums were still actively podcasting, and pretty much nobody had kept it up. Any museum who had ever produced a podcast with any regularity had dropped somewhere along the way, and SF MoMA's lasted until last year. So it had a 7-year run, and then we're sort of reassessing. We're assessing what the future should be. But I did an evaluation a couple of years ago in which I took a survey of the listeners to the users of the SF MoMA Artcast, and learned that a very, very small number of them, at least of the people who responded, had ever been to SF MoMA. Very, very few of them lived in California. A number of other questions revealed that these people were not necessarily museum people or art people. These were podcast people. There was they had such a non-connection to the institution of SF MoMA or anything that we were really trying to do, and it was cool to think that the Artcast had been adopted by the podcast listeners. It meant we're doing something right, but it was so utterly disconnected from the museum's mission, and I just wonder if anyone would like to speak to that.
I guess one thing when I was researching this panel was just looking at the numbers for podcasting, and it's funny because I think similarly organizations we used to produce podcasts for, like the National Gallery, actually stopped it just before the serial boom, and I think it's interesting to kind of ask that question of who are the people that are listening, and the trends are really pointing to the fact that podcast listening is going up, and it's such a segmented niche kind of market. Oh, sorry. There's such an incredible diversity of podcasts and so many niche audiences for them that I think it's actually really interesting to think that there might be a type of podcast audience, but also an audience that is super kind of specialized and interested thereon. So there might be the kind of the super users, and then also what I was seeing in my research, just kind of Pew research and that kind of stuff, that I think NPR gained like 10 million podcast listeners last year. It's just like crazy. Like, it's just something that I think it goes towards like how people are listening now.
I think when podcasts first came about also and were being made, they kind of occupied the blog sort of perspective a little bit, which was a little insidery, little inside baseball, and a little still full of kind of the investigations of the things that the people inside an institution might be the most interested in, or conversely, an effort to educate people with a deeper understanding of something, a message that museum or an institution was already trying to convey, but trying to do it in a new form. And I think what happened was podcasts, this moment that we've got this renaissance of podcasts, is that podcasts have turned more into these thematic radio-like conversations that are entertaining and transportative and not necessarily tied to learning something important.
One thing I will say, though, they are still kind of inside baseball, but in a different way now. I think they're inside baseball in a self-referential way. So you get most out of a podcast by having listened to the whole podcast series and by knowing the references they go back to and things like that. It's still inside baseball, but it's also inside baseball from podcast to podcast as well. You know, I listen to Reply All, which is an amazing podcast about the internet you should all be listening to. But they also do things like, they recently had an episode where the host from Song Exploder, which is another podcast all that breaks down songs, came and broke down their entry music, like their sort of podcast music. And they did another one, like they refer to the mystery show and things. It is actually still inside baseball. It's just inside baseball whereby you get to know all the other podcasts.
Well, and the cool thing, I think, Tim, is just that we're talking about audiences. So we have a museum audience, but we know that when we connect to existing audiences, we sometimes have our greatest success. So with the Smithsonian's example, it's going to be really interesting to see if it's supported as a sort of, it's ironic because it's sort of the brand people are saying, let's not call it Smithsonian, with the idea saying, let's talk about ideas because we have these great experts here. You know, it will be tied into Smithsonian some way, but it's not right at the top. In other words, it's acknowledging, saying, we know you're out there, we know you're interested in ideas, we have some great ideas, and let's talk about it.
Yeah, I'm already in, having just heard that clip.
Yeah.
Like, it got
great.
me.
Yeah.
That's great.
So we should probably wrap up. I've just put everyone's contact information back up there, but we're also going to share some show notes, so referencing all the different things we were talking about. And I recognize in our description we said we would cover a lot more, but I hope you got something out of just having this more talk show style, and hopefully we can talk more about kind of installation-based stuff and other things.
I'm going to end with a fake ad that I stole from Stephen Colbert because I think it's, if you listen to podcasts, you'll get it. Let's see. This panel is brought to you by Questography. What is Questography? Well, that's a great question. Take our online quiz to find out. Millions have already asked what Questography is, and now it's your turn. Use the offer code, Questography. What?